Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Okay, well, hello again, and welcome to one of the most expecting sessions of this conference, the New Direction 2021. We are delighted to have Dr. Matt Chapman from University of Wisconsin-Madison here today to discuss about test development under the influence of COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, a very interesting title of this session, Who Gets to Decide? Hi. Yes, we can hear you all. My apology. That's a sound effect right there. But let me continue because I think you all can be very excited for this session. The session title again is very interesting. Who gets to decide? Keeping equity in mind when testing digitally and remotely. So Dr. Matt Chapman is the Senior Assessment Innovation Manager, and his work focuses on developing new language proficiency tests for K-12 English learners in US for public schools and international schools. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Chapman, please be assured that you can let us know any of your thoughts or questions in the chat box. And we will have 10 minutes at the end where this question will be addressed. Please start by sharing your screen, Dr. Chapman.
Thanks so much, Q, for your kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Let's see if I can pull up the PowerPoint. All right, I think we can see that okay. I'm not on mute. That's a good sign. All right, I think we're ready to go. So again, thank you, Q, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who are joining. As Q just mentioned, the title of my talk is Who Gets to Decide? Keeping equity in mind when testing digitally and remotely. And as Q mentioned in her introduction, I work for Weeda at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the United States. And my Zoom backdrop here shows you the lovely city of Madison. I'm actually joining you today from Kyoto in Japan. And I want to look back on the year of 2020, which presented some incredible challenges for test designers and test developers. So the theme of our conference is greener, fairer, stronger, right? Forgive me if I got that in the wrong order, but the focus of my talk is definitely on the fairer aspect of this conference. So let's get going. So let me talk about the context and the issue at hand, the question we're going to address, and the process that we went through to respond to the question. So the context is language testing in the United States, specifically testing English learners in kindergarten through grade 12 in public schools all across the country. And I'm going to talk about two particular assessments that are used to evaluate these students. So when I talk about English learners, what I'm really talking about is students who have grown up in families that use languages other than English at home. So many students who are classified as English learners in the US were born in the US. They've lived in the US for all or most of their life, but in their home environment, many of them will perhaps speak Spanish or Arabic or Chinese. And when they come into contact with the all English language US school environment, they can face some challenges learning the academic English that they need to be successful in the classroom. So the assessments I'll be talking about today are intended to evaluate students' language proficiency in that academic context in US public schools. The issue is the COVID-19 impact on in-person test administrations, and the question, are remote administrations of these assessments possible? And I'll give much more detail about the two assessments in the next 15 to 20 minutes. The process I'm going to describe to you is what Weeda engaged in last year, and I was very involved in. It was a systematic collection of requirements from key stakeholders. I'll describe who they are, and collaborative decision-making between the test developer, Weeda, and our stakeholders to determine whether we could or should remotely administer these tests or not. So just quickly, a bit more on this United States context. So again, we're talking about students in grades K through 12 in the public school in the US who have been classified as English learners, and there are more than 5 million such students across the United States currently. There's a long history of case law in the US that provides a number of protections for these students, and the case law dates back to the civil rights era of the 1960s, and states that English learners must receive equal opportunities for academic advancement as their monolingual English peers, and that they are entitled to language support services if they so need them. And English language proficiency testing of English learners in the public schools in the US is also mandated by the US federal government, by the Department of Education. And it's a process that involves identifying students who are English learners and placing them into appropriate classes for support, monitoring their progress annually. And when they are deemed to be proficient, they're no longer classified as an English learner, and they're in the general education system, same as all other students. So the Weeda, the organization I work for, and whose assessments we are talking about today, we're a non-profit. We're based at a large public research university, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Weeda produces a suite of language assessments, a set of language development standards, sort of akin to the Common European Framework, but for K-12 English learners in the United States. We provide professional learning, both online and face-to-face, to support the teachers of K-12 English learners. And we have a wide-reaching research agenda as well. So we also serve other stakeholders, particularly the parents of English learners and the educators of English learners. And at the core of Weeda's mission is a commitment to equity and social justice for these students who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So fairness, equity are very important. Okay, so that's a very quick run through the context. I'd like to now turn to the two assessments I'm going to focus on today. The ones we had to decide whether they could be delivered remotely or not. So the first assessment I'm going to talk about is called Weeda Screener. It is a screening test for students in grades K through 12. It's administered throughout the year on demand to identify newly incoming students to schools who need to be identified as English learners and provided appropriate support services. Excuse me. Weeda Screener is available to all 41 US states and territories that are part of the Weeda Consortium. And typically, the Weeda Screener test is administered at the start of the school year when students are coming new into the schools. So that's typically July, August, and September across the US. And at least 100,000 students are taking this test annually, sometimes quite a few more. The test evaluates the students' listening, reading, speaking, and writing abilities. It takes about 80 or 90 minutes. There's an online version and a paper-based version, and it is intended to be administered in person with a proctor and test administrator in the room with the students. It's a high-stakes test, scores from this assessment are used to make the high stakes decision as to whether a student will be classified as an English learner or not. The second assessment I'm going to talk about is access for ELLs. This is really our main assessment. It's a summative annual assessment for students in grades K through 12 who have been identified as English learners. It's administered to all English learners across the 41 states of the consortium, mainly in the winter, December through March. And we test at least 2 million students every year across the United States. Again, it's a full skill test. It takes about 3.5 hours. There's an online and a paper-based version, same as Screener. In-person administrations were the norm, with a proctor and an in-person test administrator. So sort of touched on this, but the main issue was closing of schools in the United States from the spring of 2020. So in-person teaching was not possible. Students switched to remote learning. In-person test administrations were not possible. And Weeda began to receive a flood of requests for at-home assessment options, something we had never thought about before. This made us all panic and run down corridors with our hair on fire because of a range of risks and concerns of remote administrations of these tests. First and foremost were equity concerns. If these students are going to test at home, will their families have a device, a computer, a tablet on which to test? If not, can the schools provide devices to families? And remember, we're talking about 2 million students here across 41 states. Some of the students we serve are from socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds, so you certainly cannot assume there's going to be a computer in the house. We had a lot of concern about scores, the stability of scores, the consistency of score interpretations. How does the remote testing environment affect our ability to understand what the scores mean? Does the stability of the Wi-Fi connection have as much impact on the score as the student's language ability? How does the variety of testing conditions impact student outcomes and interpretations of scores compared to previous years? The maintenance of score interpretations across years is essential for access, because typically students are in English language support for 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, and we have to track their progress from year to year. Technical issues meet language issues. If students are testing at home, will they be able to set up the test and understand the test administration instructions without in-person support? Of course, many of the students' family members also have developing language competencies in English and different levels of English language literacy. And how will school districts troubleshoot technology challenges, particularly for young learners and students with low levels of English language proficiency? A myriad of questions about test security, none of which are very pleasant. How do we protect the security of our test items, of our intellectual property and other test materials when they're given out to students at home? And if we were to consider remote proctoring solutions as we did, how can we ensure that only the student is responding to those test questions? Oops, excuse me. So let me begin to talk about the process by which we tried to address some of these questions and challenges. So in May of 2020, May the 18th to be specific, the US Department of Education published a fact sheet that said students have to test, English learners have to test. There was a lot of flexibility in how that testing happened. But the government put its finger on the scale and said, you will test. This set off a flurry of requests from state departments of education to Weeda to ask about how this testing could be done. This triggered us to try and form and convene groups of stakeholders to listen to their issues and to discuss the options with them. In particular, we talked with state education agency representatives and representatives of the larger districts, like, for example, Chicago Public Schools, Boston Public Schools, Miami Public Schools, who have tens of thousands of students and a range of challenges. We also talked with a variety of Weeda committees to get their expertise and particularly technical guidance. Let's talk about the two different assessments and how we responded to them differently. First of all, Weeda Screener. It's a lower stakes test. We tried to consider if we could make adjustments to the assessment to make a remote administration possible. We thought about reducing the number of language domains that are tested. We thought about utilizing previously retired test content to get around some of the security concerns. We talked about simplifying the test scores to try and get away from those concerns of score interpretation. And we began to think about, if we can't guarantee families will have a computer at home, can we at least expect them to have a cell phone? And if so, can we deliver a test via a cell phone? Which was terribly alarming. So to cut a long story short, Weeda was under considerable pressure to make a remote screening assessment available. And we ended up determining that this would be just about feasible. We did so by reducing the number of domains to be tested. We did so by shifting away from reporting numeric scores to simply reporting a recommendation that the student was probably an English learner or probably not, or we don't have enough information to make a decision, and to switch to a delivery via cell phone instead of a computer or a paper-based test administration. So we released this assessment 3 months after receiving requests for it, which was interesting. We said to our stakeholders, this is to be a temporary solution only in a period of school closures. We strongly recommended that video calls via cell phone would be necessary to make this work. And we greatly shortened the assessment from 80 minutes down to 10 to 20 minutes. For students in kindergarten and grade 1, we released only a speaking and a listening test, no reading, no writing. For grades 2 through 12, we had a speaking, reading, and listening test, no writing. So it was a drastically different assessment that we believed could be delivered remotely. So that's the screening assessment. We went through a different and more elaborate process for the higher stakes annual summative access test. But again, we considered the same questions that we considered for the screening test. However, we came to different conclusions. Working with our stakeholders, and I'll talk more about that briefly in the next slide, we determined that we could not reduce the number of domains that had to be directly tested. We could not change the scores that were reported because those scores are federally required. And we could not support administration at home via computer and on paper. So we felt we could not develop an at-home version of the high-stakes access test. Some high-level points in our decision-making process to come to that no conclusion. We convened emergency meetings of all subcommittees. There are 10 of those at Weeda. All 41 states in the consortium are represented across those 10 subcommittees. Those conversations were chaired by our stakeholders and recommendations were made by the stakeholders. Weeda had input, but we did not run that process. It was run by our stakeholders. And very interestingly, by a large majority, not a complete majority, but a large majority, our stakeholders rejected Weeda developing a remote version of Access. Our stakeholders' conclusions were that it was not possible to do this because technology could not be provided to students to test. They could not support the distribution of paper-based test materials to 2 million students, and there was no confidence about what the test scores would mean because of inequitable access to technology and inequitable access to a standardized testing condition. Our stakeholders determined that the scores probably wouldn't mean much of anything, and they recommended that we did not go forward with remote and at-home testing. And we were quite relieved with that decision. So I'm going to wrap up now. I think I might be a touch over time. Forgive me if I am. So in summary, Weeda had to respond to a very sudden demand for at-home testing, and this was completely unprecedented to us. We faced, and I know many other test developers faced, difficult decisions that had to be made on an almost impossible timeline. But we came to different decisions for different assessments. We said yes to a remote solution for one test, a screener, and we said no to a different test, a high-stakes summative annual evaluation based on stakeholder input. Let me state the obvious. Completely overhauling a large-scale assessment as 3 months is not recommended for the sake of anybody's health, particularly their mental state. And the decision to not shift to a remote option for the higher stakes test was driven by our stakeholder communication and input. And that decision-making process was one of the few, in fact, probably the only highlight of last year. So some very brief takeaways. We would strongly recommend that equity, fairness, and social justice being central in these types of decision-making processes around high-stakes assessment. The validity, security, and technical soundness of any proposed remote testing solution really will be null if equity for our students is not upheld. And we learned, much to our pleasant surprise, that stakeholders can greatly assist in making these hardest of decisions if they feel they're being given a fair voice in the decision-making process. Phew. Okay, I think that's me done. I hope I haven't run over time too badly. I think we have a few minutes left for questions.
Yes, it is. I'm about to say that we actually have a few very good questions. I think you really want to address this soon, as we have very limited time left. Okay, let's go to the first one from the audience. Johanna, one of our colleagues at Breakout, have a question. Thank you, Mark. Do you think that providing a shorter screener will mean that future stakeholders will expect you to continue using shorter screener, potentially to save costs?
That's an excellent question. I must admit, when we were doing this, we didn't think too much of the long-term implications. We did try to emphasize to our stakeholders, you know, the remote screener, the shorter version, was a temporary solution. It would only be supported by Weeda during a period of school closures. And interestingly, as students went back in person in the United States, we have been talking with our stakeholders about retiring remote screener. And actually our stakeholders have supported us retiring remote screener. So access to the materials, access to the training has actually been pulled down from the portals where we provide that. And most of our stakeholders supported that decision. It's hard to keep everybody happy, isn't it? There were one or two key stakeholders who would have liked that assessment to remain available from Weeda, but the majority said we could pull it down, and we did. And as of now, nobody has asked us to shorten the length of our regular tests. And I hope I'm not jinxing the situation by saying that out loud.
No, I hope not. Don't worry. Thank you, Mark. But that's a very interesting point. Thank you, Johanna, again. We do have another question from Jamie Clayton. So I will straight ahead to that. So what happened to the ELL students at the end of the school year? Did they move on to the next grade?
Oh boy, if only it was so simple.
Oh, it's not.
No, but there's a very long answer to that question, but I'll try and keep this relatively brief. As students went back to school last year, we worked with our stakeholders to make, unprecedented changes to the testing window for the assessment, which typically runs December through March. We actually tested this year into September. So we more than doubled the length of the testing window. All of the score reporting deadlines were changed. And when I say all, I literally mean all of them. We didn't maintain a single state's reporting timeline. So a lot of stresses for psychometricians, a lot of stresses for decision makers who use the test scores. And we also had a lot of work to try and help our stakeholders understand what the scores mean, because we had about 70% of the regular population test, right? So 30% of the regular population didn't test. The key question is, who was missing, right? Was it the high performers who didn't have to test? Was it the socioeconomically disadvantaged who weren't in school and didn't get to test? Was it the lowest performers who didn't test? Right? We're trying to work with our stakeholders to work out who the missing 30% is, because without knowing that information, we have a lot of trouble helping our stakeholders interpret the test scores. So I think a lot of decision making is actually on hold for these students until the states have got a better sense of what the test scores mean. So I suspect a lot of students who would normally have been reclassified or exited from English learner status perhaps did not, because of a lack of confidence in what the scores mean.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. That is a very well proved answer, given the fact that it's a very complicated answer. Well, I'm afraid we don't have much time, only 1 left minutes, but allow me to give you the very last question from Lily. I think Lily Ahmad. The question is, when the test domains were reviewed, what measures had been taken to ensure the validity of the test?
That's an excellent question, and that's very challenging. So 2 things we tried to do. So we shifted, as I said, from reporting a regular numeric score to simply reporting a recommendation. We also communicated as loudly as we could that we strongly recommended that these scores or outcome recommendations were supported by the administration of the regular longer test when that was allowed. We don't have the right to impose that as a policy. It was a suggestion, but we recommended as strongly as possible that students who are potentially English learners are screened again when they're back in school to support the outcomes of the shorter test. But Lily is absolutely right that there are serious concerns about validity of these assessments that are made so quickly in response to stakeholder requests. And we tried to be very, very clear in our guidance about how to interpret recommendations and how to follow those up by more testing when that's possible.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lily. I do think that's an excellent point to raise, given our current circumstances with the pandemic still ongoing and seem to gonna last for some time more. Well, it is, well. Okay, that's one very fun. Thank you, Mark. That's for a very insightful presentation. Well, unfortunately, we come to an end of this session. Well, please leave us some feedback on this session by answering the 2 short questions that you see in the survey tab next to the chat box. We thank Mark again. Thank you very much for your presentation. We thank you, the audience, for the participation, and hope you continue to enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.